Hello again. If you've already watched the first two video lessons, you're probably wondering by now, when are we going to get to start writing some code? And so the answer is we're going to start right now. In this video, we'll talk about the events and how to handle events that occur within your applications by writing some code. We'll keep the code simple for now by just setting properties at runtime for the controls on our forms. And over the course of the next 3 or 4 videos, we'll tack on more of the C# language so that you can include it in your applications. So let's get started by talking about events. Visual C# 2005 Express Edition helps you create event-driven programs. Now, what is an event-driven program? All that means is that your applications will respond to events. And an event can be something as simple as program started, or could be user clicked button, or maybe it's user typed a certain key on the keyboard, or any number of interactions between your program and anything else that's outside of that program. Your users are just one source of events. Windows itself can send messages to your application like shut down or data coming from the internet to be processed. Other programs can trigger events in your application as well, and as I'll demonstrate in just a moment, there are literally hundreds of possible events that your application can react to. Now, in all honesty, I'm oversimplifying events just a little bit here, but I think we can use this as a working definition throughout this lesson series. Now, once you move on and start advancing your skills, you're going to realize that there's some more neat things that you can do with events and kind of the underpinnings of what events are. But I'm going to leave that for another time. Let's take a quick look at the Hello World application from Lesson 1. Let's talk about that single line of code that we created to display a message in a little message box on screen. Now, if you recall from that lesson, what we did was double-click on a button that we added to the form. And when we double-clicked on it, it brought up the code view. Now, I think I made this point at the time that at the point when we double-clicked on the button, an event handler was created for us. What is an event handler? This is the definition of the code block that would be performed whenever that event was triggered. In this case, the event is given a default name, button1_click. And then there's some other words that are on that same line, like private and void and object and event args and things of that nature. They may not make a whole lot of sense right now. Let's not worry about them. We'll talk about them later. Then underneath of that, we have these 2 curly braces. And I said at the time that we need to make sure that we write this line of code between those 2 curly braces. So this event handler defines a section of code that will be triggered and executed whenever that event is fired off by the end user clicking the button. So it gives this particular event a name, button1_click, and we can change the name, although we probably don't want to do that right now. Now, what are those little curly braces? Well, they define in C# a block of code, or rather code that either works together to accomplish a task. In this case, that task is to handle that button1_click event, or the code blocks used to organize code. So if you scroll up and down through this code view and you just look at the other lines of code that are available here, you'll see that there are more sets of curly braces, and the code view does something very nice for you. It allows you to roll up and expand these code blocks. There's one called one that's right underneath something called a namespace, and one that's underneath the class. And you can see that it's kind of hierarchical, that some code blocks can own other code blocks, and they're all defined by indentation and these little curly braces. Now, for the next few lessons, we'll just keep in mind that when we write code, we'll be typing it inside of these curly braces, the ones for our particular event handler. And we're going to talk about code blocks several times in the next few lessons, so let's just keep that idea open that a code block is anything between 2 sets of curly braces. There's one other thing we didn't talk about at that time, and that was the use of an end-of-line character, which is our little semicolon. Every line of code that we write has to end in a semicolon. Now, you'll notice that there are lines of code that don't have semicolons, like this line of code, for example. But the reason that is because it defines a code block called an event handler, or a method. So just to recap, events happen within your application, and you write your applications to respond to those events. And events can come from a number of different sources, and the way you respond to events is to write code within a code block called an event handler. A code block is defined by curly braces, and each code block is given a distinct name. In this case, the name is button1 underscore. Now before we move on, I want to introduce a new term. We've called this block of code an event handler, but an event handler is a type of a more general structure called a method. And we'll be writing and calling, or rather triggering, our own methods in Lesson 6. 95% of the code that we write will appear inside of a method. So it's an important building block, and I wanted you to start hearing that term now. Now let's get back to event handlers. Like I said earlier, there are hundreds of possible events that we can write code to handle. The question is, how do you know what other events are available to you? Do you have to memorize hundreds of these events or commands? Absolutely not. In Visual C# 2005 Express Edition, there are 3 ways to determine which events a particular object, like a control for example, can respond to, and then go on to create an event handler for it. The first and most obvious way was to double-click on the object in the design view, which we did actually in the first lesson. So in the case of the button, the default event handler is a click event. So each control's default event will depend on what makes sense for that particular control. But most of the time, the default event is at least one of the events that you'll want to handle, like a click event, for example. But what if you need to handle an event that's not the default event? Well, the easiest way to go about seeing all the available events for, say, a button or any other control is to go back to the design view like I've just done, and go to the Properties window for that given control, make sure it's selected, and then select this little events icon, which looks like a little lightning bolt. And when you click on it, you're going to see a list of all the possible events that can be triggered for this particular control. And they are categorized as well by action, appearance, behavior, and so on. So for example, if we wanted to respond to a leave command, so this button will no longer have the focus, what we can do is double click the entry in the property window, and all of a sudden we have a new event handler that was created automatically for us, button1 underscore leave. Let's go back to the design view just for a moment and look at all the properties. It's up to us to decide whether or not we want to handle any events for a given control. For example, labels, we may not want to handle any events for them. Even if somebody clicks on them, we're going to ignore any type of event that happens. That's our prerogative as the software developers. But we also have the ability to handle each and every single event that's listed here. Now, more often than not, you're not going to need to do that. In a simple scenario, you may need to only handle one event. In a more complex scenario where you have dragging and dropping, or you want to work with the resizing or the repainting of the form somehow, you might have as many as 6 or 12 events that you want to handle for a single control. That's very much on the high side. So this isn't something that you should spend a lot of time being concerned about, but occasionally you're going to need to work with an event that is different than the default event that's available to you by just double clicking on that given control. So the third way that we can create an event handler is actually for us to type them in ourselves. Now I'm not going to demonstrate how to do this because it's so much easier to just use one of the previous methods that I just showed you. But I want to make the point that there's really nothing magical going on here. You could type all the event handler code in yourself. Visual C# 2005 Express Edition just does it for you, mistake-free, in order to speed up the process of writing applications. Okay, so now you should understand a little bit more about events. Let's get on to some more fun stuff. Let's write something meaningful within those event handlers. In the previous lesson, we looked at how to adjust the properties of an object, like a control, using the Properties window, and we talked about how this is just a shortcut to actually writing the code ourselves. So now we're going to start writing code in our event handlers that actually changes the property of an object on our form ourselves. Instead of letting Visual C# do it for us, we're going to take control and we're going to change those properties ourselves when we want to change them. So let's do this. Let's create a new project, and we'll call this Lesson 03, and click OK. I don't want to make any changes to my previous project that was open. So I want to keep the example fairly simple still. So I'm going to go to my toolbox, and I'm going to find a text box, drag it onto my designer surface, and then I'm going to find a button and put that on my design surface as well. Now what I want to do is whenever I click the button, I want to change a property of the text box. The property I'm going to change is the text property. So by changing it, I should be able to put a new message inside of that text box. So I'm going to double click the button to get the default event handler. Then I'm going to type some code. So in order to access or reference that particular control, I'm going to have to use its name. Now by default, each control is given a name. I think we already talked about that in the previous lesson. So, for example, button 1 is given, the first button we put on our form will be given a name, button 1. If we were to add another button, it would be given another name, button 2, and so on. Same thing with the text box. Text box 1, if we were to add another text box, it would be text box 2. And it's up to us to rename these controls by using the name property within the properties window right here. But we're going to leave the default name for now and work with text box 1. So I'm going to double click, go to my event handler, and here I'm going to reference text box 1, and now what I want to do is reference a single property of that text box. I want to reference the text property, so I'm going to use the period on my keyboard, and I'm going to type in the word text, I'm going to use the space bar, and I'm going to set that property equal to hello world. And then I'm going to use my end-of-line character. Now, why did I wrap the word "hello world" in quotation marks? We'll talk about that in the next lesson when we talk about strings. So let's just ignore that for right now and just take it at face value. So now let's run our application to see if it works. We'll click our button, and the message "hello world" appears. We have changed the property of the text box, setting the text property equal to hello world. And we can change just about any property on our text box by using the same method, by referencing the name of the object, using that dot notation, and then typing in the property name, and then setting it equal to some value, the appropriate value for that given property. Let's take a quick moment to point out some of the ways that Visual C# 2005 Express Edition helps you when writing code. So let's bring this up a little bit higher on our code view, and I'm going to highlight this and then use the backspace button on my keyboard to delete the entire line. Let's retype this line and talk about what you saw as I was typing this line of code. So when I started typing the word text box 1, did you notice that little window that appears? This is called IntelliSense, and it helps you in two ways. First of all, it's a visual reminder of the names of the objects that you might want to refer to when you're writing code. Now, if I was typing along and I forgot the name of my text box, this would be a visual reminder. So as I type, the options become more narrowly focused on what I'm typing, and I can use the up and down arrow keys on my keyboard to traverse this list and see all of the available items that I could use. So notice that this is a pretty long list. I mean, I can go down quite a ways in either direction, and I'll explain more about all of these items that you see here when we talk more about the .NET framework in more detail. But once I find the item that I'm looking for, I don't have to type the entire word out, which is the second benefit of getting comfortable with IntelliSense. All I need to do is select the next logical terminating character. Now in this case, that's going to be a period, and it's going to complete the rest of the word so I don't have to type it all out. And it's going to give me a list of all the properties as well as all the methods and events that are available to this object. So I'm just going to put the period. Now I only spelled this out halfway, but you can see it's highlighted text box 1, and notice that it completed the word for me. So this reduces my spelling mistakes, and I have the added benefit of not having to type so many characters. I can type much more quickly if I get used to using IntelliSense. Now it's going to, by default, bring me to the default property for that given control. Now again, I can go up and down, look at all the properties as well as methods and events. You can see the events have the little firebolt, the little bolt of electricity there, and that these methods have they're like little boxes that are moving, and properties have little fingers that are pointing to a piece of information on a little form. So that's how you can differentiate what each of these are. But we're going to only want to reference properties at this point in time, and that's the IntelliSense works similarly too. Whenever I type in the letter T, you notice I get the word text that pops open, and if I need to go text align, I could type in the entire word text and then A, and then it would bring us to text align, or go back and it goes back to text. So some very neat functionality there. Also, you can see off to the right in a little yellow message box, it gives you a little bit of help as to what that property or method or event actually is there for. So it's a quick reminder as we look at the various properties and methods what this does. It gets or sets the current text in the text box. Okay. Now again, let's move on, and I'm just going to use my space bar and hit the equal button, and then I wound up typing in the rest of this line of code. And once you get good at utilizing the IntelliSense, it's going to reduce the amount that you have to type by, I'm just guessing here, maybe 20%, and it'll increase the accuracy of your code. Now, of course, that does require that you can touch type and you can keep your eyes on the screen, which just comes with a little bit of practice. Now, admittedly, we haven't written a lot of code just yet, but I want to get you started with a few good habits up front, and one of the best habits you can possibly get into is to comment your code. A code comment is just a description of what a section of code is attempting to accomplish. So you need to make your comments to remind yourself of your thought process or the reason that this section of code even exists, and you need to do it so that it's in clear language. Comments don't get compiled into your program, and they don't make your application larger in any other way. They're just there to remind you and anybody who might work on this application after you of what you were trying to do. So we highly recommend that you use as many comments as make sense. And there's two ways to create comments. The first way to create a comment is to use 2 backslashes and then type whatever comment that you want to make. This is a C-sharp comment. The other way to create a comment is to start with a backslash and then use a asterisk. And now I'm going to demonstrate that this is a multi-line comment by using the Enter key several times on my keyboard. And then to stop the multi-line comment, I'm going to put a final backslash. So to start a multi-line comment, you will use slash asterisk, and then to stop it, you'll use asterisk slash. And here we can type anything we want because this is a multi-line comment. You can even see that comments are grayed out. They're kind of in a lighter shade of gray. This is to let you know that they don't really have any impact on your application. When you get started, it's easy to forget comments. And even for some of those who have been doing this for a while, we might forget to take the time to write some comments occasionally. But it's much easier to read through well-written comments and to try to understand what the code is doing than to have to interpret what the code is actually attempting to accomplish by reading the code line by line by line. So I'll have more to say about writing meaningful comments at the end of this series of videos when we're building our RSS Reader application, and that's when it's really going to hit home the value of making good comments within our applications. Okay, we're just about finished with this lesson, but while we're here in the code view, I thought we could take a quick aside and look at a few more features so that you have a good comfort level, since, after all, this is where you're going to probably wind up spending the majority of your time while creating software. A little bit earlier in this lesson, we talked about how using the code view you can collapse and expand code blocks by using the little plus and minus buttons off to the left-hand side. And that's convenient if you want to get some code out of your way and not view everything at the same time. It can be sometimes confusing to have all this code available and visible to you. It's nicer just to roll it up. Well, the good news is that you can create your own little regions, your little roll-up areas, in order to group together different methods that might have a common purpose or goal, or you can also create a region inside of a method like our event handler code in order to organize long passages of code so you can find out what you're looking for more easily. Now, in order to create your own region, what we'll do is go into our code view, and we'll start off using the pound sign and type in the word region, and then we'll use a space or two here, and then we can give this region name. This is a region, and to end our region, we just have to do something like this, end region. And here we can type in code or anything that we want. I'm just going to make a few comments. Nothing in particular. Okay, so now here we get to see the magic of the region. Let's go ahead and click the little minus sign in order to collapse this area, and you'll notice that there's this little box around our region, and we can even hover our mouse cursor over the region box, and it gives us at least a synopsis of the code that's located within that region. And we can expand it by clicking the little plus button. So this is a great way that we can hide or show passages of code that might take up a lot of visual space, and as we're searching through all of our code, we may just want to hide it or give it some type of descriptive title. Here's another great tip in regards to writing comments. Say you find an answer to a question that you had while you're coding, and it's something that applies to the application you're working on. You found a great MSDN article that you'd like to remind yourself exists, so if you ever come back to this point in your code, you can remind yourself of this thought. What you can do in your comments is add a hyperlink. So let's go to this multi-line comment that we already have and type in an address, and notice that it has an underline underneath of it, and in order to follow this hyperlink, all we need to do is hold down the control button and then click the link in our source code, and it'll pop open a web browser and navigates to that website. So that's pretty cool, and it's very useful whenever you're trying to document exactly what you're doing. You could also put it to any online documentation that you might provide for other developers who are working on the same project you are. So these are just a couple of